with the responsibility, sometimes it's hard to just feel that sense of adventure that allows that purity to thrive.
This is Joe Wong. Welcome to The Trap Set, where each week we explore the lives of drummers. I want to play something for you. You're hearing As Within by my guest, Orpheo McCord. Born into a bohemian family, Orpheo was raised in California and eventually studied percussion in Ghana, Mali, Cuba, Morocco, and at Berklee College in Boston. Orpheo's diverse body of work comprises recordings with Marky Smith in The Fall, Fool's Gold, and Cass McCombs. Since 2007, he's been a member of Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros. Orpheo recently released his first solo album, Recovery Inhale, featuring meditative, electronically manipulated marimba pieces. We recorded this conversation on a boat off the coast of Southern California. And now my conversation with Orpheo McCord.
I grew up mostly in California.
And your dad went to mime school, right?
My dad studied with a French mime named Jean-Louis Barrault.
Like the most famous mime ever.
Kind of the most famous mime ever, yeah. And my dad was his protege in Paris when he was in his 20s. And he was a part of kind of the whole mime troupe in San Francisco and grew up in Berkeley, California, so he was a part of the whole...
Like the Merry Prankster scene?
Yeah, my dad was a Merry Prankster. And so he was like a mime, Merry Prankster, doing a lot of stuff with the Grateful Dead and eating a lot of LSD with his friends.
And what was your mom's trip?
My mom's trip, she is French and American. Her father's American. She grew up in Paris. Her mother's French. She came to the States every year with her father, as a kid, and then moved to the States. I think she's quite young. I think she was just about 20. And she came here to do modeling. She was the kind of high fashion model in Paris, came to New York to do that. Wasn't that into the whole dynamic of what that meant. So she got over it kind of quick, moved to California. Shortly after that, met my dad, and then kind of went on a whimsical adventure with him.
And then you were born of that adventure?
Yes.
Were they together when you were growing up?
They were together until I was about 10, and then they split.
How would you characterize your relationship with them when you were growing up?
Well, they're both kind of eccentric characters in their own way. And then we would move around. Basically every 2 years we were in a new spot. My dad's an actor mostly at that time, trying to land gigs, whether it be a commercial or a TV show or doing theater. So we kind of would be moving around as he would get different gigs. And
did it start working out for him?
They worked out okay. He would have little stretches that were okay, but it never worked out, I think, the way that he would have liked it to work out, So
as somebody that went into an equally unstable profession, what did you draw from watching the way your parents went about their business?
Well, I definitely feel blessed with the fact that having creative, artistic parents, they supported me through my process. And, you know, with my father studying classically as a mime and studying with somebody like Jean-Louis Barrault, who was very disciplined, and, you know, persistence was something that was really something he would remind me of through my creative process of what it takes to become masterful at anything. So, you know, that in combination with just supporting being a musician, which I feel like is a lot more than some other friends of mine I had growing up with their parents, and, you know,
Right.
it just wasn't practical.
Right.
So,
When did music become really more your thing, like part of your identity, something you wanted to actually do rather than just consume?
God, you know, it seems such a natural progression for me. You know, I think definitely growing up around music and around artists, and my dad always had musician friends who would be over at the house, or, you know, I mean, one significant memory I have before I took up any instrument was going into a recording studio up in the Bay Area of a friend of my dad's, and just being totally in awe of this amazing environment with all of these instruments and microphones, and, you know, how clean and streamlined everything looked, and how focused it was and creative. And I remember really being turned on by that idea, and he put me up and sat me up behind the drum set, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And that stuck with me, and I think I just always had that curiosity and a natural inclination towards rhythm. I just, you know, we had some drums around the house, and I would always like to bang on them, even when I was just a few years old. So it just kind of naturally progressed into when I was 9 years old. We were living in Santa Barbara at that time, and I just said to my dad, I'd love to get a drum set and start taking some drum lessons, and he was like, okay, let's do it. And then it kind of started there, and that was my formal starting point of learning.
At that point, was it your main focus in life, or was it a hobby?
God, at 9 years old, I mean, I would say that I definitely had a strong identity with it. And then by the time I was 13, by that point we moved back to the LA area, I started jamming. I would say that was really the most like significant, where it really became a strong part of my identity, was when I started to actually play with other musicians. Mm-hmm. And, you know, as a drummer, when you take up any instrument as an adolescent, you know, you're sitting there a lot of the time by yourself in your room practicing or whatever, playing along with recordings. So all of a sudden you get these opportunities to play, and there were a couple older friends that were pretty good, you know, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, this is it. Everybody's vibing,
that
and
feeling
all that
of playing music in the room with people for the first time.
Yeah, and that just that natural connection that you have with this other person. And once I started to have that experience, I would say it really became a strong part of my identity. And at that point, I knew this is what I wanted to do with my life. And luckily I had parents who were, you know, egging me on to do it.
This episode of The Trap Set is brought to you in part by Colectivo Coffee. Handmade coffee since 1993. Check them out online at colectivo.com.
Went to Berklee College of Music. It's the only school I auditioned for. I didn't really ever think that I would go to college, but going to a more academic performance arts high school that was geared towards, it was a prep school, so everybody had to apply for college and went to the school. So I'm like, all right, well, I'll try Berklee College of Music, and got accepted in, and had never been to the East Coast in my life. Threw a backpack on, thought I was in the dorm room. For some reason, I just assumed if you were a freshman and you got in that there was automatically a place in the dorm room, because they said it's technically mandatory that you're in the dorm the first year.
Right.
2 weeks before school starts, just call in and be like, hey, well, so where's my dorm room, blah, blah, blah. They say, we don't have a room here for you. You never signed up to be in the dorm. And I said, oh, shit. What am I going to do? And so I got
to say, that place is one of the most poorly run institutions I've ever experienced. It was just terrible.
God. It was terrible. And nobody let me know. And so being an 18-year-old, it was kind of fun. It made it more a part of the whole adventure. I just had to go out there, had no idea where I was going to live. There was a family friend who happened to have an apartment in what was that neighborhood? Over somewhere in the south end. And they were gone. I was able to stay in this apartment.
But did you like it there?
I would say that I came in with a completely different idea of what I thought would be a school like Berklee College of Music. I immediately assumed, a bunch of kids that are, in their late teens, early 20s, from all over the world coming to explore their mutual passion of music. It would just be this like melting pot of creativity, and it would just be like exciting, like band, like everybody wants to like do different stuff, and and then there would be this faculty there nurturing this whole creative process. And I'd never been to Boston before, and I, not to talk down on Boston, but it's not one of my favorite cities that I've traveled to. For somewhere that's supposed to be a liberal, it's historically known as a liberal place. It's pretty square and uptight and boring, really. I thought it was a beautiful city. It's aesthetically beautiful. Growing up in California, all of a sudden being in these, brownstone neighborhoods, I thought it was pretty amazing, but boring, And 5 years later, when I came back to California, I remember just driving. I had my car full of all my shit. Just driving, and I saw the skyline of Boston in my rearview mirror, and I just yelled out, I was like, "You!" Just coming back to Cali.
So you went there for 5 years?
I went for 4 years, graduated, and then Jack Adams, who I mentioned earlier, him and I had a group at Berklee called Clones Don't Have Belly Buttons, and with some other Berklee students, and they were all a year younger than me, so I decided our game plan was, okay, I'll wait another year, we keep playing music, and then we'll all move to LA after you guys graduate. So we did.
Wow.
And then the band fell apart within 2 months of being back in LA.
So then what happened? Are you the kind of person that comes up with a game plan consistently, or do you just kind of go
I never
moment
have
to
a game
moment?
plan. I never have a game plan. And if I do, it kind of happens very much in the moment. I'll have some sort of inspiration of a direction I want to move in, and then I'll focus my energy on manifesting the path, ideally of least resistance to get there. But as we all know, there's many variables that come with any kind of direction you think you're going to be moving into. So from that point, ended up, so my mom ended up having a place up in Idlewild where I went to high school. When I went there, she ended up getting a place my senior year because my sister got into school there for dance. So she ended up buying a place up there, and ended up living there through that whole time that I was in college. And at that point was ready to move back down to LA. So as the band was kind of breaking up, fresh back in LA, I went up to Idlewild to help her move down to LA and met a lady, fell in love with her, and ended up staying up there for 3 years in Idlewild. Then 3 years down the road, it was a series of events that happened. It was pretty clear that it was time to move. I was going to either move to New York or I was going to move to LA, and just based on a series of events, it was clear it was time to go to LA. And when I did, things seemed to be in alignment.
How did you know that you needed to come here?
Well, it was basically, things were kind of, I would say, cycling out with my relationship with my partner at that time. Her and I were just going through some stuff, and it was like, and I was kind of clear at that point that I was like, oh, I'm going to go to New York. This is what I want to do. She was not really wanting to be in the city. And I kept it open. I was like, okay, well, I want to go to New York. Do you want to go with me? And she was like, no, I don't want to go to New York. She said, but I would go to LA. And she was initially trying to make her way to LA from Chicago when she first got lost on a road trip and ended up in Idlewild, and that's how she ended up living there. So I said, okay, well, let's give it a shot together. And we went down to LA, moved down to LA together, and it didn't really last long. It was a few months after that. It was obvious that we had to part ways, and we did. And at that time, it was like, musically speaking, my career was just like, everything was moved. The energy was just really moving in a clear direction. And it was.
Did you feel that momentum at the time, or
I did? It did. I felt it, and I was actually like, I came down and I was teaching drum lessons at my friend's music shop. A friend that I went to high school with in Agora Hills. He had a music shop at that point, and I needed work, and I called him up, and he's like, "Hey man, come teach drum lessons at my place." And I was like, "Great." Wasn't that into the idea. It's always fun to teach kids music, but it's not really my passion. So I did it, and I enjoyed it, and it was fine. But once these other things started to come in play, it was like it felt like I was in the right place at the right time, and I could feel it. I could feel it and embrace it and move with it.
In this spare room, we better see what we have and who. And I owe you for the same thing. Only angels have wings, so they say.
The Trap Set will always be available for free, but we rely on donations from our listeners. Please visit our website at thetrapset.net and click donate. Subscribe to our show on iTunes, and if you enjoy what you hear, give us a review.
What was it about your relationship with Cass that felt special to you?
Well, I definitely right off the bat saw how prolific of an artist he was. I mean, he's an amazing singer and an amazing songwriter. And, he was schooled, and he grew up, I think, doing a lot of choir stuff, and that's where he developed his voice. And he just had this natural sensibility for lyrics and melody, and then he was always really open to me doing different stuff as a drummer and percussionist, and I would always, for recording, would always kind of do a lot of both. Usually start with drum set stuff and then add percussion, but some stuff would just be like, get some weird wood box and a rock and just throw a cymbal on the ground and just do weird stuff. And I was always really into experimenting like that, and so it was fun to work with an artist like that, And there was just like a purity at that time for all of us. Now we're all approaching 40.
So how did you lose that purity?
How did I lose the purity? Well,
do you think you did?
I think there's still some purity left in me, but
if there's only some, then it's not purity, right?
I guess that's true. It's watered down. Watered down whiskey.
What is it watered down with? I mean,
Well, I would say responsibility, man. I mean, that's a big one I reflect on a lot these days. I mean, back then, I didn't have any responsibility. You know, it was just about, I knew I wanted to be a musician, and I imagined what that would look like, and, you know, I achieved, and then some, what I wanted to, what I aspired to become. I think as an artist, though, you always have that itch. There's always something more. You get what you want, and you're always like, oh, it should be more and more. You always want more, and maybe that's a natural part of always pushing towards something bigger. But
a challenge that I'm trying to embrace is to try to appreciate what I have while I have it, instead of always looking towards the next thing.
That's a huge lesson for all of us in life, no matter who we are and what we do. You know, keeping things, appreciate what we have in the present, and what we do have, particularly in our culture. I mean, we're so lucky. We're so blessed. I think that with the responsibility, you know, sometimes it's hard to just feel that sense of adventure that allows that purity to thrive, where if something starts to infringe upon that purity in your life, you can just kind of be like, okay, you can shake it off and run off into another direction and see where you go. Once you start to have a family, and all of a sudden, you know, starting to make some real money as an artist, and then your lifestyle, you start to get used to certain comforts, and, you know, your overall monthly expenses start to grow. Have a couple kids, get married, have a house. All these responsibilities start to make the whole picture look a little bit different.
But had you just remained single and fancy free, do you think you would be as fulfilled as you are now?
It's no, because I feel like one of the greatest gifts I have is being a parent. You know, I have 2 children. 4-month-old and a son who's almost 4 years old. And, you know, I mean, it's interesting. I think being an artist, my wife's an artist. She's a musician and a writer. And when we had our son, we were both, she was touring just as much as I was, and we would see each other maybe 50% of the time. And it worked. And I think that's part of what makes it still work for us, is that she was the first partner I had that really understood what it was like to be on the road and what that meant and how unglamorous that was, you know, and wasn't jealous of what that might look like, or me being gone, and could be supportive. We could be supportive of each other. But when we had our son, we were really happy to have a child, but it was kind of an identity crisis for both of us. You know, I think you can be 2 artists, you can be 2 self-involved people, and still have a supportive relationship, because you both kind of understand what that means and what it takes to be an artist and to keep growing. You have to really be pretty self-involved. But all of a sudden, you have a child you're responsible for. It's not about you anymore. So that was a bit of an identity crisis. It took us a while to adjust to giving ourselves fully over. But then once we did, we were able to adjust and also really, you know, our perspective of our free time completely changed. Time became so much more precious. And so we learned how to focus our free time creatively, and in many regards, her and I both get way more work done and get the creative juices flowing more now than we did before we had kids, because we had to create a structure. You know, once you have children, you have to create a structure. And that structure is kind of good. As artists, it's sometimes, and it depends, different artists are different, but a lot of the time, it's just kind of structure free until you go on tour, and then there's some tour manager, or you're, you know, whatever, everything's kind of set up, and you have this structure that you're just like, get on the bus at this time, sound check is this time, shows this time, and like you got this structure, and you're just kind of floating around it. Now all of a sudden you put this kind of structure into your family life and your personal life. It was a real positive. I never really felt that I was one who enjoyed structure, but it is something that's really been beneficial, and I feel like I'm creating more of my own creative works now than I ever have in the past.
Do you think you're less self-involved in general now?
Definitely less, but I'm still pretty self-involved.
What does that mean? Like, what do you think about when you're saying that you're self-involved?
It's just oftentimes just stuff based around the career, just like things that I want to keep moving towards, to accomplish, to keep growing as an artist. And oftentimes that just takes a lot of bandwidth, personal bandwidth to keep that focus. And so...
do you think you're any more or less self-involved than your parents were when you were growing up?
I'm definitely less self-involved than my parents.
So you took it one step forward.
Yeah, I took it one step forward. Yeah, definitely. And I could say self-evolved to a point, but I would also say as a drummer, our role generally, and I think it's part of maybe how it's been a part of my destiny as a musician too, is I am kind of naturally a nurturing type, and I like family, and I feel like that role fits really well into being a drummer.
Like,
because
being the drummer is like being the mother of the family.
Well, it is in a way, and you're first of all, you're not a front person most times unless you're Phil Collins, so you're in the back, and oftentimes you're there supporting somebody who's more up front. Usually, oftentimes you're supporting and developing somebody else's song, and oftentimes singer-songwriters, are pretty nervous and neurotic or self-conscious about what it is they're sharing, understandably so. And so, I always found that I was pretty good at, and it was very natural for me to do so, but to help nurture them, be like, oh, this is great and this is good, and just, getting them excited about their process, and that being really a big part of these folks in appreciating having me around, kind of a grounded comfort.
I think it's over now, I think it's ending. I think it's over now, I think it's beginning. A 7-year cycle seems to happen every day. I walk up the hill and then descending every way.
Earlier, you alluded to the fact that at a certain point, your income went up, and that at some point kind of became a burden, or it was an expectation that you wanted to maintain. So when did that happen? Who were you playing with?
Well, I mean, when I was playing with The Fall, I definitely got paid the best that I ever had to got paid, and Marky Smith, who's the mastermind behind the group, who started it back in 1976, he only dealt with cash, with all the promoters, whatever. He only did everything with cash, and he was based out of England. I would oftentimes have to go fly out there. I was flying out there really often, once every couple months, and he never got us work permits. He was so punk rock, and then would pay us all in cash, and paid us well. After our first show with him, he was so pleased that he doubled our pay from that point on, and then just kept that as our rate, whether it was in dollars or whether it was in pounds. And at that time, pounds were double. It was $2 to the pound.
How did you hook up with him?
I hooked up with him. It was kind of a strange story. So he's from Manchester, so he had a band of all Mancunian fellows, and his wife, who was a German lady 20 years younger than him, who played synth. And they were on the first leg of a U.S. tour. This was in 2006. And I think they hadn't done a U.S. tour in a while. And he didn't like buses, so he would either want to be in the back of a van, or I guess they convinced him to get a motorhome this time around. And so he was in a motorhome with the band, traveling, and he only liked to travel during the day from gig to gig. And I don't know, a few shows in, he had some kind of big blowout with the appointed U.S. tour manager and his band. So they literally left him like 2 shows in the middle of the night at a hotel. He woke up the next day with his wife, no tour manager, no car. They took the motor home. He had nothing. I think he was in Phoenix or something. And so he was a part of Narnak Records. His U.S. label was Narnak Records. And Narnak had another artist who lives here in L.A., Emmett Kelly, who goes by Cairo Gang. And he wasn't living in L.A. at the time. He was in Chicago. But he, the head of Narnak, called Emmett because the next gig was in San Diego for the fall and said, Emmett, you know, Mark doesn't want to go home. He wants to continue this tour. Can you find me a rhythm section like in the next 2 days? So we were a rhythm section. That night we went in rehearsal space, learned, I mean, their catalog's massive. He has like 28 studio albums or something like that. So we had no idea. Nobody told us what to learn. And we went in, learned just some random songs that we liked. We're like, oh, maybe I want to do this. Met him the next day. He was playing the House of Blues down in San Diego. Met him for the first time in the cargo elevator. People were telling us all this stuff because he's known as being this kind of crazy, ornery dude. And it's like, don't look him in the eyes. Like, don't talk to him too much. Just do blah, 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 whatever. And I just went in with my whole nurturing way, and I was kind of like somewhat affectionate for like a hard, blue collar Mancunian.
You were like, what's really wrong?
No, just like, just give him a little rub on the back and be like, hey, Mark, how's it going, man? And it was interesting. He was kind of out of his comfort zone because he had 3 guys who are from California, good musicians, and we took it seriously. We were a tight rhythm section. And he normally had like younger guys from Manchester. They all looked to him as kind of a god. So he always had this kind of position of power, and he would exploit it oftentimes. Now all of a sudden, he was in a situation where he had to get something together. Was Americans, so he was kind of slightly out of his comfort zone. And after we played that, and so he was kind of quiet and shy. That when we were meeting him, we did a little sound check, and then we just played a really solid set, and he was so happy and pleased that he doubled our pay that night, and we did that whole tour, and he was really sweet with us for the most part. And I don't know if sweet's the right word for Marky Smith, but he was respectful.
Have you ever thought about pursuing something else as a career and just keeping music as a passion?
I totally have, but then I'm like, shit, I don't really know how to do anything else. I'm like, damn it, why don't I know how to do anything else? I have, and I've like thought about going back to school.
When do you think about that? When it's harder, or do you just get restless?
I definitely think about it when it gets harder. I've been on hiatus. Edward Sharp's been on hiatus for a little over a year now. It's the first time that I have not been on the road in, I would say, over 12 years. It's the weakest financial year I've had in a long time. So just kind of living off what I've saved up, and that definitely adds a stress, especially having 2 kids. So I definitely am like, yeah, what else could I do? What do I like to do? What do I love? And how could I turn that into a career? And that's just kind of forced me to, and having this much downtime, this has forced me to get a little bit more creative about what I do know how to do, which ultimately is music, expression through art. So, that's brought me into other places, one being the album that I just finished, which is kind of like a meditative marimba, kalimba meditative record.
When you think back to the feeling that you got when you first started playing with other musicians when you were, 14 years old, how often do you get that feeling or that intensity from playing music now?
God, it's such a different experience now than it was then.
So then let me ask you this. Is that a feeling that you still seek, or do you seek something else?
I think so. No, I think that is always the feeling, right? It's like anything. It's that first time you get high. That first hit, like any addict, right? Everybody's chasing that first high. Yeah, I think that definitely, that purity and that joy. And, I think that I'm sure other musicians that you've interviewed have probably talked about, how it can be challenging when you're on tour and you're repeating the same songs over and over again for it to not feel redundant and to feel that sense of joy. And I think some musicians are really good at faking it, on stage, where it's like, wow, I'm loving this song even though I've played it 6,000 times in the last 2 years.
Well, Orpheo McCord, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Joe.
The Trap Set is produced by me, Joe Wong, along with Chris Karwowski, who also edits the program. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Trap Set, and visit our website, thetrapset.net, to subscribe to our show for free. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please donate to our show. If you can't afford to donate, please tell a friend and give us a good rating on iTunes. Send your feedback and guest requests to thetrapset@gmail.com.